Thank you, Keith, for your kind introduction and for your invitation to speak at the FCC on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover, and to share with you my own thoughts as a scholar on this hugely important topic with democracy and Hong Kong, a civilizational state perspective. As you know, I always describe the nature of the Chinese state as a civilizational state, which means an amalgamation of world's longest continuous civilization with a super large modern state. And I myself coined the phrase civilizational state over a decade ago to distinguish it from the term then used a lot called civilization-state, used more by Western sinologists, notably American sinologist Lucien Pai. He asserted China as an ancient civilization only, yet pretending to be a modern state. My view is vastly different. I think China today is, first of all, a modern state, yet with many civilizational features. Interestingly, by now, however, the two expressions, civilizational state and civilization state, are used almost interchangeably beyond the academic world in the global mainstream political narratives. But that's fine with me. And to better understand the meaning of a civilizational state, I may draw some analogies. I would say, for instance, if the Roman Empire has lasted until now and united and transformed into a modern state, today's Europe could be a medium-sized civilizational state. Or if dozens of Islamic countries today could integrate into one unified modern state, it could also be a civilizational state of over 1 billion people. Yet all these are hypotheses only. As a civilizational state, China is a blend of old and new, and it's an amalgamation of hundreds of states into one with its long history. And this state is bound to be unique. It has at least 4 distinguished features. 1, a super large population. 2, a super vast territory. 3, a super long tradition or super long traditions. And 4, super rich cultures. What's more important is in each of these features, there is a blend of the ancient and the modern. Let's first look at briefly China's super large population, a fact since the ancient times. China has thus an unparalleled scale of almost everything, from the scale of the market to the size of the economy and to the number of well-educated population. For instance, China now each year produces more engineers than all the Western countries combined. And this fact alone changes the world. As for China's super vast territory, which is inherited from our ancestors, but it's now covered with the world's largest and most advanced networks of bullet trains and highways, with the first-rate digital infrastructure, with 1.6 million 5G stations installed across this vast continent, accounting for nearly 70% of the world's total. Now, with regard to the super long traditions, China's traditions have evolved, developed, and adapted in virtually all branches of human knowledge and practices. For instance, the West is highly critical of China's so-called one-party system. Yet to most Chinese, it's nothing extraordinary because since its first unification in 221 BC, China has been mostly governed by a unified ruling entity. Otherwise, the country disintegrated. And China copied the American political model after the 1911 Republican Revolution. The country soon degenerated into warlords fighting each other with millions of lives lost. Furthermore, this unified ruling entity has been buttressed by a system of meritocracy, with officials selected through public exams, or what's called the Keju system China invented in the Sui dynasty close to 1,500 years ago. Now, interestingly, this ancient system has been adapted into today's what I call selection plus election. If you look at the Chinese top leadership, top echelon leadership, they have almost all served at least twice as the number one of a Chinese province, given the size of China, which means literally they've governed, administered more than 100 million people before taking up their current positions. As a result, China's top echelon leadership is obviously among the most competent in the world. Likewise, the tradition of a unified ruling entity has carried with it a holistic way of political governance for this huge and vast country. For instance, I would describe Western-style political parties as partisan interest parties, and the Chinese Communist Party as a holistic interest party. This explains why China is able to reform and reinvent itself all the time when you have a holistic interest party pioneering the way to overcome all kinds of vested interests, resisting changes. As for super rich cultures, China has perhaps the richest cultural heritages, being a civilizational state. For instance, diversity in harmony is a hallmark of Chinese religious culture. In China's long history, there were very few religious wars. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted, cross-fertilizing, which is a sharp contrast with so many religious wars throughout European history and Western history, till even today, some would say. And this deep-rooted culture of diversity and harmony has also allowed for one country, two systems to operate for Hong Kong over the past 25 years, something unthinkable, inconceivable for typical nation state. Furthermore, China's political culture tends to prioritize people's livelihood. In today's context, this means whatever the state does, political, economic, or social policies, they must all boil down to deliver tangible benefits, material or non-material, to the people. And the Chinese model values what the system delivers to the people, rather than indulging in empty rhetoric. I'm afraid it's a hallmark of many Western political systems. For instance, I remember when Obama came to power with his famous slogan, change, yet after 8 years, without much change. This is inconceivable in China. There are also two important concepts, which is Mingyi and the other is Mingxing in the Chinese political governance culture. Mingyi refers to a more or less public opinion, and Mingxing approximately refers to the hearts and minds of the people. These twin concepts were first put forward by Mencius in the 3rd century BC, but highly relevant for today's internet age. Public opinions can be fleeting and change by hours with today's social media. Yet Mingxing, or the hearts and minds of people, are mostly stable and lasting. So despite the rise of populism in China, like elsewhere with the internet age, the Chinese state has on the whole practiced rule by Mingxing, thus allowing the country to better overcome short-termism so prevalent in the West, and is also able to plan for the long term, and even for the next generation. It follows that as far as democracy is concerned, the Chinese approach starts with what we call the Dao, or the overall purpose, objectives of democracy. In the context of Chinese culture, it will be about good governance. And then the Shu, which means specific procedures, measures, etc. So Chinese believe that the ultimate test of a good political system is not procedural democracy, but to what extent it can ensure the objective of democracy, that is good governance. So I advocate all along, since many, many years ago, a paradigm shift from the outdated Cold War-like paradigm of so-called democracy versus autocracy, to good governance versus bad governance, we should encourage different political models to compete with each other to see which model delivers good governance as judged by their peoples. Indeed, by international standards, I would say the American model of democracy, is in multiple crises. I remember Madame Pelosi, the US House Speaker, described the right, from our point of view, in Hong Kong in 2019 as a beautiful sight to behold. Yet amazingly, this beautiful sight soon reached the Capitol Hill, reached her office on 6 January last year. I remember a tweet went viral across the world, including China. If the United States saw what's happening on Capitol Hill, the US would invade the United States to liberate the United States from the tyranny of the United States. Another tweet also went viral. They're the first coup d'etat that happened in Americas without the participation of the US Embassy. Indeed, this is how most non-Western countries view American democracy today. If we adopt, say, the criteria of Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as a measurement of democracy or good governance, I would say that virtually all leading credible international opinion surveys tend to review and suggest China has done better than the United States. For instance, Democracy Perception Index 2020, conducted by Dahlia Research based in Germany, 87% Chinese believe their government works for majority, while only 48% Americans think so for their country, and 52% Americans surveyed believe their government serves a minority. China became the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity in 2014, with the world's largest middle class of 400 million people, real middle class by Western standards, if not higher, larger than the US population. And China today has a life expectancy higher than the United States, than the American, 77.9 years old for China and 77 for the United States for the year 2021. Due to the two countries' different approaches to fighting the COVID. China's official data shows that 90% of China's civil servants come from ordinary family background, while Nobel laureate Professor Stiglitz, my great friend, describes US as a country of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And the latest PEW survey found that 72 Americans don't think the US is a good model of democracy for others. That's also unprecedented. The list goes on. As I told Professor Fukuyama 11 years ago in a much publicized debate you also mentioned early on in Shanghai, he said China needs political reform to embrace multi-party system. And I said that both China and the United States need political reform. But personally, I think the United States need more political reform, as US system, political system, is a product of pre-industrial era. Without substantial political reform, I predicted 11 years ago, the US may produce a leader worse off than George W. Bush. It turned out to be true for many, and I wish to repeat this forecast again here for the coming US election or elections, so long as the country is unable to conduct meaningful political reforms. It will be deep trouble. Again, this broad background of the rise of China as a civilizational state, and with the unfolding Ukraine crisis in view, the world seems increasingly divided. For example, over this sanction on Russia, the Western countries and its allies support sanctions, and the non-Western world don't support. As Italian ex-Prime Minister Berlusconi rightly put it, Russia is isolated by the West, and the West is isolated by the rest. And what's more important, many non-Western countries today also claim themselves to be civilizational state. Russia, Iran, India, Turkey, etc., all claim themselves today as civilizational state. Of course, one may argue over their definition of civilizational state, yet there is apparently a shared common theme in their public assertion and statements. They are somehow fed up with the Western meddling in their internal affairs and the Western condescending lecturing, and their message to the West is very simple: we're a unique civilization, please show your respect and mind your own business. Now, before concluding, I will touch upon another aspect of civilizational state, which is directly related to the future of Hong Kong. If one looks at the Eurasian continent, one sees easily many what I call interfaces between civilization on this vast continent, stretching from Kiev to Istanbul, to Singapore, to Hong Kong, and to Shanghai. These metropolises are in many ways also civilizational, in the sense that they constitute interactive and transaction nodes between East and West, between civilizations, between diverse cultures, and their checkered history, the ups and downs they experienced, shows that these transaction nodes operate either as a bridge between civilizations, between East and West, between diverse cultures, or as a contested outpost driven by clash of civilization and cultures, with one attempting to domineering over the other. Hong Kong should, of course, be a bridge, not contested outpost between civilizations. This also reminds me of the tragic fate of Ukraine today. Back in 2014, when the West supported color revolution sweeping Kiev, with the US government insisting that Ukraine had a full sovereign right to join NATO, Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, counseled Kiev that if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it should not join NATO, and that it must not be either side's outpost against the other. Rather, it should function as a bridge between them. In retrospect, I think Kissinger's counsel is more sensible for America's own interest, for European interest, and for Ukrainian interest. Indeed, history and geography dictate in many ways the fate of interactive nodes between civilizations. From Chinese point of view, you may wish to disagree. The National Security Law for Hong Kong, promulgated by the Chinese National People's Congress in 2020, is a decisive step to have saved Hong Kong from the tragic fate of Kiev. By the way, it's also reported at the high time of Hong Kong crisis in 2019, the Ukrainian neo-Nazi Azov Battalion sent its veterans to Hong Kong as expression of solidarity. I should be very candid here. In the eyes of the most Chinese, I repeat, the most Chinese, 90% if not more, the West has already made a mess of Iraq, made a mess of Afghanistan, made a mess of Libya, made a mess of Syria, and now Ukrainian. So millions of lives lost, tens of millions homeless. China will never allow these tragedies to happen in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang or elsewhere in China. Only a civilizational state can allow for one country, two systems. But this diversity in harmony is based on mutual respect. If one side tries to take down the other side through an act of color revolution, this act will have to be brought to justice according to law. In the context of civilizational politics, the West has for too long and is still pursuing a strategy of divide and rule since the colonial times. In contrast, China pursues and prefers just the opposite, what I call unite and prosper, which China believes represents the best interests of most peoples. And not long ago, I met an old friend, former Pakistani ambassador to China. He told me that he toured the United States 2 years ago to give lectures on China. He was constantly asked a question: what's the future of China? And his reply was always very simple. His reply was, China is the future. I share his view. And the ideas I have outlined just now from a civilizational state perspective, which you may agree or disagree, such as meritocracy, good governance, prioritizing people's livelihood, balance of Ming-Yi and Ming-Xing, balance of Dao and Shu, and interface between civilizations are all very crucial for China's successful rise over the past decades, and for Hong Kong's prosperity, I think, as well. So at this critical moment of history, I hope these ideas will be relevant and even inspiring to many others, including those in the West, including those among the audience, as well as those in Hong Kong, when reflecting on this future of democracy and future of Hong Kong. Indeed, China has learned so much from the West and will continue to do so for its own benefit. We are from a culture of learning from others. It may be time and now for the West. I would use Deng Xiaoping's famous phrase, to emancipate the mind, to learn more about or even from some of the Chinese approaches and Chinese ideas, however extraneous they may appear, for their own benefit. This is not only to avoid a possible collision between the West and this hugely important nation, a civilization by itself, but also to enrich the world's collective wisdom in tackling all the challenges and crises facing mankind. Well, I think I will stop here.
Thank you.
And many thanks again for your presence. And I'll be more than happy to take your questions.